Meet Clint Eastwood, Hollywood legend, filmmaker, and a man who built his career on standing up to arrogance. But when he walked into one of San Francisco's most exclusive restaurants in a simple polo and slacks, a young waitress made a humiliating mistake. Samantha Hayes, blinded by her own biases, mocked the bold man sitting in her section, assuming he didn't belong among the city's elite. But what she didn't know. Clint didn't just have a table, he owned the entire restaurant. What happened next was a lesson she, and everyone watching, would never forget. Hit subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories like this. The Silver Oak was one of San Francisco's most prestigious restaurants, a place where wealthy tech executives, social media influencers, and business elites gathered to flaunt their status. Every evening, the air buzzed with conversations about million-dollar deals, luxury vacations, and the latest trends. Amid the extravagance, Clint Eastwood, dressed simply in a charcoal gray polo and slacks, sat quietly in his usual corner, sipping whiskey. To most, he was just another older man blending into the background. But Clint wasn't just a customer, he was the owner of the restaurant. When Samantha Hayes, a sharp-tongued waitress with a strong bias against old money, saw Clint, she dismissed him as someone who didn't belong. She had no idea she was about to make the worst mistake of her career. What happened next wasn't just a moment of reckoning, it was a lesson in humility, respect, and the true meaning of class that no one in that restaurant would ever forget. Samantha Hayes had always considered herself progressive, forward-thinking, and fiercely independent. At 27, she had just landed a job at the Silver Oak, a high-end restaurant known for catering to San Francisco's elite. She saw it as her chance to mingle with the city's most powerful figures, tech billionaires, venture capitalists, and social media influencers. She believed success wasn't about hard work or legacy, it was about status, image, and knowing the right people. That's why, when she saw Clint Eastwood sitting alone at a table in the corner, dressed in a plain polo and slacks, she instantly dismissed him. He wasn't one of them. To Samantha, he was just another out-of-touch old man, probably a conservative relic clinging to outdated values. He didn't look like someone who belonged in a restaurant where a single steak cost over $200. Instead of greeting him with the same enthusiasm she reserved for younger, flashier patrons, she barely made eye contact. Instead, she focused her energy on impressing the influencers documenting their gold leaf desserts for Instagram. What Samantha didn't know, what would soon humiliate her in front of the entire restaurant, was that the man she was ignoring didn't just have a reservation. He owned the entire place. And before the night was over, she would come to regret every word. Samantha finally made her way to the table where Clint Eastwood sat, her iPhone tucked into her apron, ready to check notifications the second she walked away. She put on her most professional smile, the one she saved for VIP guests, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sir, I couldn't help but notice you've been nursing that house whiskey for quite a while now." Her tone was polite, but underneath it was a hint of condescension. Clint looked up, his expression calm, his piercing gaze unwavering. "It's a good whiskey." His voice, steady and gravelly, carried a quiet authority that made Samantha hesitate for a moment. But she quickly recovered. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable at the bar," she suggested, glancing toward the tables filled with wealthy guests. "This section is usually reserved for our more exclusive patrons." She expected Clint to look embarrassed, maybe even apologize. Instead, he took another slow sip, completely unfazed. Nearby, Carlos, a young busboy, watched in silent horror. He recognized Clint instantly, his father had introduced him to Eastwood's films years ago. Carlos knew exactly who the legendary actor and director was. Samantha, however, had no idea she was making the worst mistake of her career. And the quiet man sitting in front of her? He wasn't going to stop her. He was going to let her dig her own grave. Across the dining room, Mark Reynolds, the restaurant's longtime manager, observed the interaction with growing unease. He had worked at the Silver Oak for over a decade and knew exactly who Clint Eastwood was. He also knew Samantha, a sharp-tongued, ambitious waitress who thrived on catering to the wealthy and dismissing anyone she deemed unworthy. Mark had seen it before, the way she ignored older guests who didn't dress the part, how she fawned over social media influencers and venture capitalists, eager to impress. But tonight, he sensed something different. Tonight, she was about to cross a line she could never uncross. Meanwhile, Carlos, the busboy, was practically holding his breath. He had grown up watching Clint Eastwood's films with his father, admiring the man's no-nonsense attitude both on and off the screen. He had spent months working at the Silver Oak, quietly doing his job, but he knew this wasn't just another customer. Samantha, however, remained oblivious. Her attention was fixed on Clint's casual outfit, his simple drink order, and the way he sat so comfortably in a place where others worked so hard to prove they belonged. To her, he was out of place. She was so certain of her judgment that she didn't realize the truth. She was the one about to be humiliated, not him. Samantha adjusted her apron and exhaled sharply, growing impatient. This man was wasting valuable space. She glanced toward the entrance, where a group of well-dressed tech moguls stood waiting for a table. To her, they were real customers, people who understood luxury, people who deserved to be here. Turning back to Clint, she decided to make her point clearer. "Our menu is quite exclusive," she said, her voice taking on a practiced, refined tone. "And the prices reflect that." Clint raised an eyebrow slightly, but his expression remained unreadable. He took another slow sip of his whiskey, unfazed. At the next table, an older couple who had been dining at the Silver Oak for years watched in growing discomfort. The husband started to speak up, but his wife touched his arm. She recognized the look in Clint's eyes, the same measured, patient expression she had seen in his films. Meanwhile, Carlos clutched the edge of his bus tub, trying to suppress his frustration. He knew Clint had been coming here for months. He had seen him shake hands with Mark, chat briefly with the head chef. And yet, Samantha, blinded by arrogance, had no idea she was insulting the man who could decide whether she kept her job. And Clint? He was letting her dig herself deeper. Samantha's patience was wearing thin. She tapped her pen against her order pad, then forced another smile. This time, it was completely hollow. "Would you like me to explain the menu to you?" slowly, she asked, her tone deliberately condescending. Nearby, Carlos sucked in a breath. That was it. She had gone too far. Clint set his whiskey down, his movements slow, deliberate. He looked at Samantha, but there was no anger in his expression. Just the same steady, unreadable calm that had made him a legend. "No need," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I know exactly what's on the menu." Carlos couldn't take it anymore. "Miss Hayes," he said hesitantly, stepping forward. "Maybe we should get Mr. Reynolds." Samantha shot him a sharp glare. "Stay out of this, Carlos. Go bus tables." Carlos clenched his jaw but took a step back. Clint's eyes flicked toward him briefly, just enough to acknowledge the young man's attempt to help. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "One last time," Samantha continued, raising her voice slightly. "This isn't some roadside diner. This is the Silver Oak. We have standards." Across the room, Mark Reynolds froze in place. He knew exactly what was coming next. And when Clint Eastwood finally decided to respond, it wouldn't be loud, but it would be unforgettable. The entire restaurant seemed to pause. Conversations quieted, forks scraped against plates, and nearby guests subtly turned their heads. Mark Reynolds, the manager, stood motionless, his heart pounding as he watched the moment unfold. Clint Eastwood, the man who had commanded Hollywood for decades with his quiet authority, finally leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Standards," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Tell me, what exactly do you think this place stands for?" Samantha blinked, caught off guard by the question. She hesitated, but then, doubling down, she straightened her posture. Modern luxury, she declared, gesturing toward the sleek decor, the crystal chandeliers, and the well-dressed guests. An experience for people who understand refinement. Clint tilted his head slightly, considering her words. And that would be, them, he asked, nodding toward a group of influencers taking selfies with their extravagant plates. Samantha crossed her arms. They get it. They respect what the Silver Oak represents. They're not here pretending to be something they're not. A few veteran servers exchanged knowing glances. The irony of her statement was almost painful. Clint let a small, knowing smile play at the corner of his lips. Pretending, he murmured. Interesting choice of words. Samantha didn't realize it yet, but she had just handed Clint the perfect opening. And before the night was over, she would deeply regret it. Samantha huffed, feeling her control over the situation slipping. She had dealt with difficult customers before, people who complained about the price of wine or requested substitutions that ruined the chef's carefully crafted dishes. But this old man wasn't just difficult. He was smug. She squared her shoulders. Listen, she said sharply. I've tried to be polite, but you clearly don't belong here. This isn't some set for one of those old cowboy movies. This is a prestigious establishment, and I won't have you ruining the experience for our real guests. The moment the words left her mouth, the entire restaurant fell silent. Across the room, Mark Reynolds felt his stomach drop. Carlos's bust tub slipped from his hands, crashing to the floor. At the next table, an older couple audibly gasped. Even the tech moguls and socialites, who had previously been absorbed in their conversations, turned to see what had just happened. Clint's expression didn't change. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and pressed a single button. Jerry, bring me the ownership papers, he said casually. Right now. Samantha's confident stance wavered. She let out a nervous laugh. Excuse me. Clint set his phone down and looked at her, his voice calm but cutting. You see, Miss Hayes, 6 months ago, I bought this restaurant. And just like that, her entire world collapsed. Samantha felt the blood drain from her face. Wait, what? She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Across the room, Mark Reynolds closed his eyes briefly, exhaling in defeat. Carlos, still frozen in place, looked between Clint and the stunned waitress, his heart pounding. A moment later, Jerry Matthews, the restaurant's accountant, arrived carrying a leather portfolio. He walked straight to Clint, handing him the documents with quiet respect. Clint took them, flipped through a few pages, and placed them on the table in front of Samantha. Go ahead, he said, gesturing for her to take a look. Samantha's hands trembled as she reached for the papers. There it was, Clint Eastwood, sole owner of the Silver Oak. The silence in the restaurant was deafening. A few guests leaned in, whispering to each other. Even the influencers had stopped taking selfies. Clint let her absorb the reality before speaking again. You know why I bought this place? He asked. Samantha could barely nod. Clint picked up his whiskey and took a slow sip. Because I wanted to make sure it stood for something real. He met her gaze, unshaken. And tonight, you showed me exactly why that still matters. Samantha swallowed hard. For the first time all night, she had nothing to say. The weight of Clint's words settled over the room like a thick fog. Samantha's fingers gripped the documents, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. She had spent the entire evening mocking not just a customer, but the owner of the restaurant. Clint leaned forward slightly, his voice as steady as ever. 50 years ago, I walked into a restaurant just like this. I wasn't famous yet, just another guy looking for a good meal. The owner treated me like I mattered, not because of who I was, but because that's what real hospitality looks like. Samantha's throat tightened. But tonight? Clint continued. You looked at me and decided I wasn't worth your time. Mark Reynolds finally stepped forward, his face unreadable. Carlos stood straighter, his chest swelling with quiet pride. Clint picked up the documents and set them aside. "Now, I could fire you on the spot," he said matter-of-factly. Samantha flinched, bracing herself. "But that's not what this place is about." Clint's voice softened just slightly. "So I'm going to give you a choice." Samantha swallowed hard. "A choice?" she whispered. Clint nodded. "You can walk out that door. Or, you can stay and actually learn what real hospitality means." Samantha had never felt smaller in her life. Samantha's breath was shaky. Every instinct told her to run, to escape the humiliation, to pretend this night had never happened. But as she looked around, she realized something that made her stomach twist even more. No one was on her side. The wealthy diners she had worked so hard to impress weren't defending her. The influencers had stopped filming, now whispering among themselves. The older couple who had been watching nodded approvingly at Clint. Even Mark Reynolds, her manager, wasn't stepping in to save her. Clint let the silence linger, giving her time to think. Then, he turned to Carlos, the young busboy who had tried to stand up for him. "Son, how would you like to start training as a waiter?" Carlos's eyes widened. "Really?" "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." Clint nodded, then looked back at Samantha. "Now, what about you?" Her throat felt dry. The arrogance that had fueled her all evening was gone, replaced by something new. Humility. She hesitated, then finally spoke. I'd like to stay and learn. If you'll let me." Clint studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Good choice." The tension in the room eased. But Samantha knew, this was just the beginning of her lesson. Weeks later, the Silver Oak continued to thrive, not because of luxury, but because of the values Clint Eastwood had reinstilled. The restaurant's reputation wasn't just built on fine dining and exclusivity anymore, it was built on respect, humility, and genuine hospitality. Samantha had changed. She no longer saw guests as a status check but as individuals worthy of good service. She watched and learned from veteran staff, took notes from Carlos, and slowly earned back the respect she had lost that night. Her arrogance had cost her dignity, but her willingness to change had given her a second chance. On Friday evenings, Clint Eastwood still sat in his usual corner, sipping whiskey, blending in. But now, when Samantha approached his table, she greeted him not as an inconvenience, not as someone who didn't belong, but with the respect he had always deserved. One evening, as she set down his drink, she hesitated. "Mr. Eastwood, thank you." Clint raised an eyebrow. "For what?" She swallowed, then met his gaze. "For not firing me when you had every right to." Clint smirked slightly, picking up his glass. "Respect is something you give, not just something you demand." The lesson had been learned. And Samantha would never forget it. As time passed, the Silver Oak became more than just a high-end restaurant, it became a symbol of true hospitality. Clint Eastwood's lesson lived on, not just through policies but through the way the staff treated every guest, regardless of their status. Samantha, once blinded by arrogance, had transformed. She no longer judged customers by their clothes or wealth. She worked harder, listened more, and understood the true meaning of service. She wasn't just waiting tables anymore, she was earning back her dignity. One evening, as Clint prepared to leave, Carlos stepped forward. "Mr. Eastwood, sir. I just wanted to say, working here has changed my life." Clint gave him a rare smile. "Son, that's what real success looks like." Samantha, standing nearby, watched the moment unfold. For the first time, she truly understood what Clint had been teaching her. As Clint walked toward the door, she called after him. "See you next Friday, Mr. Eastwood." He glanced back, that signature smirk on his face. "If the whiskey's still good." With that, he disappeared into the night, leaving behind a restaurant forever changed, not by wealth, but by respect, humility, and the power of a second chance. In a world obsessed with appearances, it's easy to judge people at first glance. But as Clint Eastwood's story teaches us, true worth isn't measured by wealth, status, or designer labels, it's measured by character, humility, and respect. Samantha thought she understood success. She believed luxury was reserved for the elite, that status determined importance. But in one unforgettable moment, she learned that real class isn't about exclusivity, it's about how you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer you. How often do we judge people based on the surface? The quiet old man in the corner, the casually dressed customer at the luxury store, the person who doesn't fit society's definition of success. But what if those very people were the ones who built everything we admire? What if the person we dismiss today is the one we'll need tomorrow? This story reminds us that power isn't just about wealth or authority, it's about how you use your influence. Clint didn't humiliate Samantha, even though he could have. He didn't fire her out of anger. Instead, he gave her a choice, because leadership isn't about punishment, it's about teaching. And in life, we all face that choice. Will we cling to our egos, or will we learn from our mistakes? Will we judge others based on assumptions, or will we choose kindness and respect? At the end of the day, your legacy won't be the clothes you wore or the people you impressed, it will be the impact you left on others. If this story inspired you, if you believe in fairness, second chances, and the power of respect, hit that subscribe button now. Daily Stories brings you eye-opening stories like this every day, because sometimes, the most unexpected moments hold the greatest life lessons. Don't miss out, subscribe now.